The hot Montana sun bore down on Zara Cooper as she stumbled through the tall prairie grass, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping the worn leather reins of her exhausted mare. A sharp pain ripped through her abdomen, causing her to double over, nearly falling to her knees. She was alone, 7 months pregnant, and miles from the nearest settlement, and something was terribly wrong. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life had brought Zara west after her husband's death. Now, as another contraction seized her body, that dream seemed to be slipping away like water through cupped hands. "Not here," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind that swept across the open plains. "Not now. It's too soon." In the distance, the silhouette of a lone rider appeared against the setting sun. Zara squinted, unsure if the figure was real or a mirage born of desperation. Her mare nickered softly, and Zara felt another contraction grip her, stronger than the last. She couldn't run, couldn't hide. All she could do was pray that whoever approached meant no harm. The rider drew closer, and Zara could make out the broad shoulders of a man, the brim of his hat pulled low against the sun. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who knew this land, someone who belonged here. "Madam." The man's deep voice carried across the distance between them. "You all right there?" Zara opened her mouth to respond, but another contraction stole her breath. She dropped to her knees in the grass, clutching her belly. The man was off his horse in an instant, covering the remaining distance on foot, his spurs jingling with each hurried step. "Madam," he was beside her now, one hand hovering near her shoulder, unsure whether to touch her. "What's wrong?" Zara looked up into the face of a stranger, sun-weathered skin, a strong jaw darkened with stubble, and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. Concern etched deep lines around those eyes. "The baby," she managed to gasp. "It's coming too early." The man, clearly a cowboy by his dress and manner, looked around at the empty landscape, then back at her, determination settling over his features. "I'm Brody Yates, madam, and I reckon you and I have got ourselves a situation." Brody Yates had seen his share of difficulties in his 30 years, but nothing had prepared him for finding a pregnant woman alone on the prairie, clearly in distress. His day had started normally enough, rounding up strays that had wandered from the Broken Spur Ranch where he worked as foreman. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, he found himself kneeling beside a beautiful woman with copper-colored hair and eyes that reflected pain and fear in equal measure. "I'm Zara Cooper," she said between labored breaths. "I was heading to Copper Creek. My uncle has a homestead there. That's a good 20 miles from here," Brody said, his brow furrowing as he considered their options. "You're in no condition to travel that far." Another contraction seized her, and Zara cried out, grabbing Brody's hand with surprising strength. He didn't pull away, letting her squeeze until the pain subsided. "There's a line shack about 2 miles from here," he said when she could focus on him again. "It ain't much, but it's shelter. Can you ride that far?" Zara nodded weakly. "I think so." Brody helped her onto his own horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chance, while he took the reins of her mare. He mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist, and they set off at a careful pace toward the line shack. The ride was slow and punctuated by Zara's gasps of pain. Brody found himself murmuring reassurances, promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but the sound of his voice seemed to calm her. "Almost there," he said as the simple log structure came into view. "Just hold on a little longer, Mrs. Cooper." "Miss," she corrected, her voice strained. "My husband died before we could leave St. Louis." Brody absorbed this information silently, a widow then, and a brave one at that, to set out alone in her condition. The line shack was as basic as Brody had warned, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and some rudimentary supplies. But it would have to do. Brody helped Zara inside and eased her onto the bed. She was pale, her forehead beaded with sweat, her dress damp with it. "I'll get a fire going," he said, turning toward the fireplace. "Need to heat some water." "Mr. Yates," Zara called, her voice trembling. "I don't think there's time for that." Brody turned back to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd helped birth countless calves and foals, but never a human baby, and definitely not one that was coming too early. I can ride for help, he offered, already knowing it wasn't a viable option. The nearest doctor was in Copper Creek, and by the time he got there and back, it would be too late. Zara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. Please, she whispered, don't leave me. Something in her plea reached deep inside Brody, touching a part of him he'd thought long buried. He crossed the room and took her hand, his calloused palm engulfing her smaller one. I ain't going nowhere, he promised. We'll get through this together. As night fell across the vast Montana territory, Zara fought a battle unlike any she had ever known. The tiny lined shack became her battlefield, the narrow bed her trench. And beside her, a stranger who was quickly becoming her lifeline. Brody Yates moved with quiet efficiency, doing what he could to make her comfortable. He built a fire, heated water in the only pot he could find, and tore one of his own shirts into strips for clean cloths. His large hands, which hours earlier had been expertly twirling a lasso, now gently wiped the sweat from her brow. You're doing fine, he assured her, though the worry in his eyes told a different story. Another contraction ripped through Zara, stronger than the last. She bit back a scream, not wanting to show weakness, but a whimper escaped despite her efforts. It's all right to holler if you need to, Brody said, his voice gruff but kind. Ain't nobody out here but us and the coyotes. Zara managed a weak smile. I don't want to scare the coyotes. The corner of Brody's mouth lifted in a half smile. Reckon they've heard worse. As the night deepened, so did Zara's labor. The contractions came faster, more intense, and Brody never left her side. He held her hand, letting her squeeze until his fingers went numb. He told her stories of ranch life, of cattle drives and summer storms, anything to distract her from the pain. In between contractions, Zara shared snippets of her own story, how she'd married young to Thomas Cooper, a kind man 20 years her senior. How they'd planned to go west together, but pneumonia had taken him before they could leave. How she decided to make the journey anyway, to honor his memory and the dream they'd shared. You're a brave woman, Miss Cooper, Brody said, genuine admiration in his voice. Zara, she insisted, her breathing labored. If you're going to help bring my child into the world, you might as well call me by my given name. Zara, he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue. A beautiful name for a brave lady. A particularly strong contraction cut off her response, and Brody knew the time was near. He'd seen enough births to recognize the signs. I think your baby's coming now, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. I need to check. Zara nodded, past the point of modesty. Brody moved to the foot of the bed, his movements respectful but purposeful. What he saw confirmed his suspicion. I can see the head, he told her, his voice tight with a mix of awe and terror. You need to push with the next pain. Zara gathered her remaining strength, determination replacing fear in her eyes. When the next contraction came, she pushed with everything she had, a primal sound tearing from her throat. That's it, Brody encouraged, his hands ready. Again when the next one comes. 3 more contractions, 3 more mighty pushes, and suddenly there was a tiny, slippery form in Brody's large hands. For a heart-stopping moment, there was silence. Then a weak cry filled the shack, and Brody let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's a girl, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A little girl. Using the clean cloths he'd prepared, Brody carefully cleaned the infant, noting with concern how small she was. He wrapped her in his spare shirt, the cleanest thing available, and placed her in Zara's waiting arms. Zara's face transformed as she looked down at her daughter, exhaustion giving way to a radiant joy that made Brody's chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. Hello, my beautiful girl, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You're early, but you're here. Brody turned away, giving mother and child a moment of privacy, using the time to compose himself. He'd witnessed something miraculous tonight, something that had changed him in ways he couldn't yet understand. When he turned back, Zara was looking at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something that made his heart beat faster. Thank you, she said simply. I thought I'd deliver alone. I was so afraid. Brody nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. Instead, he gently sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the tiny hand that had escaped the makeshift swaddling. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around his calloused index finger, and Brody felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. "She's a fighter," he said softly. "Like her mama." Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, casting a golden glow through the single window of the lined shack. The longest night of Zara Cooper's life was ending, but something new was beginning, something unexpected and fragile and full of possibility. The baby's first day of life was precarious. Zara knew her daughter had arrived too soon, and the child's tiny size and weak cries confirmed her fears. But with each passing hour, as the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, the little girl seemed to grow stronger, clinging to life with a tenacity that brought tears to Zara's eyes. Brody remained at the lined shack, tending to the horses and making sporadic trips to the nearby creek for fresh water. He hunted and returned with a rabbit, which he cooked into a simple but nourishing stew. "You need your strength," he said, helping Zara sit up to eat. "For both of you." The intimacy of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. In the span of a day, they had crossed boundaries that normally took months or years to traverse. Brody had seen Zara at her most vulnerable, had helped bring her child into the world, had witnessed her in moments no man outside of a husband should see. Yet there was no awkwardness between them, only a deepening bond forged in extraordinary circumstances. As evening approached, Brody sat in one of the chairs, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket knife. "What are you making?" Zara asked, the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest. Brody looked almost embarrassed. "Just a little something for the little one, a toy, I suppose." Zara smiled. "Have you thought of a name for her yet? For your baby?" Brody looked surprised. "That ain't my place." "You helped bring her into this world," Zara said softly. "I'd value your opinion." Brody stared at the small wooden figure taking shape in his hands. "My mother's name was Sarah. Always thought it was a pretty name." "Sarah," Zara repeated, looking down at her daughter. "Zara Cooper, it suits her." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft sound from the sleeping infant. "Tomorrow," Brody finally said, "I should ride to Copper Creek. Let your uncle know where you are, bring back some proper supplies." Zara nodded, though the thought of Brody leaving, even temporarily, filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. That would be wise. "I don't like leaving you two alone," he admitted. "We'll be fine for a day," Zara assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "Sarah and I will rest, and you'll be back before we know it," Brody nodded, returning to his whittling. But Zara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the furrow of his brow. He was worried about them, and the realization warmed her in a way the fire couldn't. That night, Brody insisted on sleeping on the floor near the door, giving Zara and the baby the bed. Despite her exhaustion, Zara found sleep elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of the future, of how quickly her plans had changed. She had come west to start a new life on her uncle's homestead, to raise her child in the fresh air and open spaces of Montana territory. Now she found herself wondering if there might be another path, one that included the quiet, steadfast cowboy sleeping just a few feet away. Morning came, and with it, Brody's departure. He had prepared everything he could for her comfort, wood stacked by the fireplace, water in a bucket near the bed, the rabbit stew warming over a low fire. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised, standing awkwardly at the door, his hat in his hands. "If there's trouble, any trouble at all, fire 3 shots. I'll hear it and come running." Zara nodded, cradling Sarah, who was awake and making soft, cooing sounds. "We'll be waiting." Brody hesitated, then stepped forward and placed something on the bed beside her. It was the carving he'd been working on a small, delicately crafted horse. "For Sarah," he said gruffly, "when she's older." Before Zara could thank him, he was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. The day passed slowly. Zara dozed when Sarah slept, sang to her when she was awake, and found herself repeatedly going to the window to scan the horizon for signs of Brody's return. The little wooden horse sat on the table, a tangible reminder of the man who had come into their lives so unexpectedly. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks, Zara felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Brody should have been back by now. She tried to reassure herself Copper Creek was a fair distance, and there could be any number of innocent reasons for his delay. Perhaps her uncle had insisted on sending supplies, which would slow Brody's return journey. Perhaps he had encountered other ranch hands and was explaining his absence. But as darkness fell and the night grew cold, Zara's worry deepened. She added wood to the fire, wrapped Sarah more securely in her makeshift blanket, and tried not to imagine all the things that could go wrong in this wild, untamed land. Just as she was considering whether to fire the 3 shots Brody had mentioned, the sound of approaching horses reached her ears. More than one, she realized with a start. Brody had left with only his buckskin. Zara's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for the rifle Brody had left propped against the wall, checking to make sure it was loaded as he had shown her. The horses stopped outside, and multiple voices reached her through the thin walls of the shack. Then a familiar one rose above the others. "Zara, it's Brody. You can put down that rifle I'm sure you're holding." Relief flooded through her as the door opened to reveal Brody, backlit by moonlight. Behind him, she could make out the forms of several other men and a wagon. "You're late," she said, trying to sound stern but unable to keep the relief from her voice. Brody stepped inside, his face breaking into a rare smile. "Had to gather a few things." He turned to gesture at the men behind him. "This here's your uncle, Elias Cooper, and some of the men from his homestead." A tall, bearded man stepped forward, his eyes widening as they fell on Zara and the baby. "Good Lord, girl, when this cowboy rode in saying you'd had the baby early, I could hardly believe it." He crossed the small space and bent to look at Sarah. "She's beautiful, Zara, looks just like her mother." Tears welled in Zara's eyes. "Uncle Elias, I'm so glad to see you." The next hour was a flurry of activity as the men unloaded supplies from the wagon, proper blankets, clothes for the baby, food, and medicines. A young woman, introduced as Elias's housekeeper, Martha, fussed over Zara and Sarah, checking the baby with experienced hands and pronouncing her small but healthy. Through it all, Brody remained, quietly helping but staying somewhat apart, as if unsure of his place now that Zara's family had arrived. When everything was settled and plans made to transport Zara and Sarah to the Cooper homestead the next day, the men except for Brody returned to the wagon to sleep. "You should go rest with the others," Zara said when they were alone again. "You've done more than enough." Brody shook his head, settling into the chair by the fire. "I'll stay here tonight, make sure you two are all right." Zara studied him in the firelight, noting the fatigue etched on his face, the stubble now a full beard after 2 days without shaving. Yet there was something else there too, a reluctance to leave, a protectiveness that went beyond duty or obligation. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Brody nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. "Just did what anyone would do." "No," Zara said firmly, "not anyone." "You." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and feelings neither was ready to name. Outside, an owl hooted and the wind whispered through the prairie grass. Inside, in the warmth of the line shack, 2 lives that had collided by chance were now inexorably linked, though what that meant for the future neither could say. The journey to the Cooper homestead the next day was slow but uneventful. Elias had brought a wagon fitted with a mattress for Zara and the baby, and they traveled at a careful pace to avoid jarring the newborn. Brody rode alongside, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of trouble. Zara watched him from under the canvas cover of the wagon, admiring the straight line of his back, the confident way he sat his horse. In just 2 days, this man had become someone she trusted completely, someone whose absence she could already feel like a physical ache, though he had not yet left. The Cooper homestead was larger than Zara had expected, a solid 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fields of wheat stretching toward the distant mountains. It was a testament to her uncle's hard work and determination over the past decade. "It's beautiful," she murmured as they approached. "You're home now," Elias said from the driver's seat, "for as long as you want it to be." As they pulled up to the house, Martha and 2 other women emerged from the front door, eager to help Zara and meet the new baby. Brody hung back, suddenly awkward in the face of domestic female energy. "Come in for supper at least," Elias said to him, noticing his discomfort. "Can't send you back to the Broken Spur without a proper meal." Brody hesitated, his eyes finding Zara's over the heads of the cooing women. Something passed between them, a question, an answer, a promise perhaps. "Much obliged," Brody finally said, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with polished wooden floors, simple but comfortable furniture, and the smell of cooking food permeating the air. Zara was ushered to a bedroom on the first floor, where a cradle hastily borrowed from a neighboring homestead waited for Sarah. After getting settled and feeding the baby, Zara emerged to find the table set for dinner and Brody seated somewhat uncomfortably among her uncle's ranch hands. He stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by the others. "Miss Cooper," he said formally. "How's the little one? Sleeping peacefully," Zara replied, taking the seat Martha indicated directly across from Brody. "And please, after everything, I think you can call me Zara." A ghost of a smile crossed Brody's face. "Yes, Madam Zara." The meal was lively, with the men eager to hear the story of Sarah's birth. Brody downplayed his role, but Elias wouldn't let him, saved both their lives from the sound of it, the older man said, clapping Brody on the shoulder. "That's not something any of us are likely to forget." Brody's eyes met Zara's across the table. "No," he said quietly, "not something I'm likely to forget either." After dinner, as the men moved to the porch for pipes and conversation, Zara found Brody standing by the corral, looking out at the mountains now silhouetted against the darkening sky. "You're leaving," she said, not a question but a statement. Brody nodded. "Need to get back to the Broken Spur. Been gone 2 days without word. Foreman can't just disappear." "I understand." And she did, though it didn't ease the tightness in her chest. They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them both too much and not enough. "Your uncle has a fine place here," Brody finally said. "You and Sarah will be well taken care of." "Yes," Zara agreed. "But I find myself thinking of a line shack on the prairie and a cowboy who held my hand through the longest night of my life." Brody turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Zara, I know," she interrupted. "You have responsibilities, a life elsewhere. I just wanted you to know that what you did, it meant everything to me, to us." Brody reached out slowly, his hand hovering near her face before gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was brief but electric, sending a shiver down Zara's spine. "The Broken Spur ain't far," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just on the other side of those hills, and I find myself with reasons to ride this way now." Hope blossomed in Zara's chest. "Is that so?" "Got to check on that little girl," Brody said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Make sure she's growing strong, and her mama too." "We would welcome such visits," Zara said, her own smile breaking free, "anytime you can spare." The sound of boots on the porch steps interrupted them, and they stepped apart as Elias approached. "Brody," the older man called, "got a bed made up for you in the bunkhouse. No sense riding back in the dark." Brody hesitated, looking from Elias to Zara. "Much obliged, but I should get back." "Nonsense," Elias insisted. "One more night won't make a difference. Besides, I want to talk to you about some business in the morning." With that, he turned and walked back to the house, leaving them alone once more. "Business?" Zara questioned. Brody shrugged. "Likely just wants to thank me properly. Your uncle seems the type to pay his debts." "Or perhaps he recognizes a good man when he sees one," Zara suggested. "As do I." In the soft light of the rising moon, Brody's face seemed younger, less weathered by sun and worry. He looked at Zara as if memorizing her features, his eyes lingering on her lips before meeting her gaze. "One more night, then," he said softly. "And tomorrow we'll see what comes." The next morning, Zara awoke to the sounds of a working ranchmen calling to each other, horses nickering, the rhythmic chopping of wood. Sarah had slept surprisingly well in her borrowed cradle, waking only twice for feeding during the night. Now the baby gazed up at her mother with alert blue eyes that Zara suspected might eventually darken to match her own hazel ones. "Good morning, my brave girl," Zara whispered, lifting Sarah into her arms. Shall we see what the day brings? After washing and dressing, Zara emerged from the bedroom to find Martha in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. "There's coffee on the stove," the housekeeper said with a warm smile, "and your uncle is out in the barn with that cowboy of yours." Zara felt her cheeks warm at the phrase, "your cowboy," but she didn't correct the older woman. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and, with Sarah securely in her arms, made her way to the barn. As she approached, she could hear the low murmur of men's voices. She paused at the open door, not wanting to interrupt. "It's good land," she heard her uncle saying. "Been meaning to expand for years, but never had the right man to oversee it. With Zara and the baby here now, I've got even more reason to build something lasting." "It's a generous offer, Mr. Cooper," Brody's voice replied, "but I've got obligations at the Broken Spur." "Talk to your boss," Elias said. "Frank Sanders and I go way back. He knows I wouldn't try to steal his foreman without good reason. Besides, I'm offering you a partnership, not just a job. Land of your own eventually, once we get the south pasture running properly." Zara's heart skipped a beat. Her uncle was offering Brody a position here, a future that could include. She cut off the thought, not wanting to hope too much too soon. "I'll think on it," Brody said, his tone measured but not dismissive. "Need to do right by the Broken Spur first." "Of course," Elias agreed. "Just don't think too long. Opportunity like this doesn't come around every day." "No, sir, it surely doesn't," Brody replied, and something in his voice made Zara wonder if they were still talking about the job offer. She chose that moment to enter the barn, not wanting to eavesdrop further. Both men turned at the sound of her footsteps, their expressions shifting from serious business to warm welcome. "There's my girls," Elias said, coming to peer at Sarah. "How's our little surprise this morning?" "Hungry and curious," Zara replied, smiling at her uncle before letting her gaze drift to Brody. "Good morning, Mr. Yates, Miss Cooper," Brody said, tipping his hat. "Baby Sarah." His voice softened on the child's name, and the tenderness in it made Zara's chest tighten. "I was just telling Brody about the expansion I'm planning," Elias said, watching the two of them with knowing eyes. "The South Pasture Project." "Oh," Zara kept her tone neutral, though her pulse had quickened. "It sounds like a significant undertaking." "Need the right man to lead it," Elias said meaningfully. "Someone who knows cattle and can handle men, someone trustworthy." The implications hung in the air between them. Zara looked at Brody, who was studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Well," Elias said after a moment, clapping his hands together, "I'll leave you two to catch up. Got to check on the men repairing the north fence." With a wink that wasn't nearly as subtle as he probably thought, the older man strode out of the barn. Alone now, Zara and Brody regarded each other in the muted light filtering through the barn's high windows. "A partnership," Zara said softly. "That's quite an offer." Brody nodded, taking a step closer. "Your uncle moves fast when he sees something he wants." "A family trait," Zara admitted, thinking of how quickly she had decided to make the journey west, how rapidly her feelings for this man had developed. "I need to return to the Broken Spur today," Brody said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do things proper, talk to Mr. Sanders." "Of course," Zara agreed, trying to hide her disappointment. "You have responsibilities." Brody reached out, his finger gently tracing the curve of Sarah's cheek as she slept in Zara's arms. "But I find myself with new ones too." His eyes lifted to meet Zara's. "If that's something you might want." Zara's heart soared, but caution tempered her response. "We've known each other such a short time." "True enough," Brody acknowledged. "But some things a person just knows. I knew the moment I saw you standing alone on that prairie that my life was about to change." "As did mine," Zara whispered. Brody's hand moved from Sarah to Zara's face, his calloused palm gentle against her cheek. "I'll be back in 3 days' time with an answer for your uncle and perhaps a question for you." Zara leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I'll be here, we both will." The sound of approaching footsteps caused them to step apart just as one of the ranch hands appeared at the barn door. "Mr. Yates, your horse is saddled and ready." Brody nodded his thanks, then turned back to Zara. 3 days, he repeated, the words a promise. Zara watched him go, Sarah stirring against her chest as if sensing the significance of the moment. As Brody mounted his buckskin and rode toward the distant hills, Zara felt not loss but anticipation. For the first time since her husband's death, the future seemed bright with possibility rather than shadowed by uncertainty. 3 days. She could wait 3 days for a chance at forever. The 3 days passed both too slowly and too quickly for Zara. She settled into life at the Cooper homestead, finding comfort in the routine of caring for Sarah and helping Martha with household duties when she could. Her uncle was a kind and attentive host, clearly delighted to have family with him after years of living as a bachelor among his hired hands. On the evening of the 3rd day, Zara found herself on the porch, rocking Sarah and watching the road that led to the property. The baby had grown noticeably in just the short time since her birth, her cheeks filling out, her cries becoming stronger. The local midwife, who had visited the day before, declared her catching up nicely despite her early arrival. "He'll come," Elias said, joining Zara on the porch and settling into a rocking chair beside her. "Man gives his word, he keeps it." "I know," Zara replied, though she couldn't help the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "I just find myself impatient," Elias chuckled. "Another family trait." He lit his pipe, puffing thoughtfully. "Your father was the same way. Once he set his mind on something, couldn't rest until it was done." Zara smiled at the mention of her father, Elias's younger brother who had died when she was 16. "I miss him still." "As do I," Elias agreed. "He'd be proud of you, Zara, making this journey, facing its challenges, bringing this little one into the world under such circumstances." He looked down at Sarah with undisguised affection. Strong stock Coopers. The sound of an approaching horse drew their attention. A rider appeared on the road, silhouetted against the setting sun. Zara's heart leapt as she recognized the straight-backed posture, the distinctive gait of the buckskin gelding. "Right on time," Elias observed with satisfaction, standing to greet their visitor. Brody Yates rode into the yard, looking more polished than when he'd left. He'd clearly taken time to visit a barber, his beard trimmed neatly, his hair freshly cut under his hat. He wore a clean shirt under his work vest, and as he dismounted, Zara noticed he moved with a purpose that sent a thrill through her. "Evening, Mr. Cooper," Brody called, securing his horse to the hitching post. "Miss Cooper." His eyes lingered on Zara, a warmth in them that made her blush. "Right on schedule," Elias said approvingly. "Come on up and have some coffee. Martha just brewed a fresh pot." Brody climbed the porch steps, removing his hat as he approached. "Thank you, sir, but if you don't mind, I'd like a word with Miss Cooper first, privately." Elias's eyebrows rose, but a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Of course, I'll just go see about that coffee." He winked at Zara as he passed, heading into the house and closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Alone now, Zara and Brody stood facing each other, the baby between them, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "You came back," Zara said, her voice soft. "Said I would," Brody replied simply. His eyes dropped to Sarah, who was awake and gazing up with unfocused curiosity. "She looks stronger." "She is. The midwife says she's doing wonderfully." Zara shifted slightly, adjusting Sarah in her arms. "And you, how was your return to the broken spur?" Brody took a deep breath. "Spoke with Mr. Sanders. He wasn't happy about losing his foreman, but he understood." Zara's heart skipped a beat. "Then you're considering my uncle's offer?" "Already accepted it," Brody said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Spent the last 2 days moving my things to the small cabin on the edge of your uncle's property. The one he mentioned was part of the deal." "Oh," Zara breathed, surprised at how quickly everything was moving. "But that ain't why I wanted to speak with you alone," Brody continued, his voice growing serious. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small, which he held tightly in his fist. "These past few days, being away from you and Sarah, it wasn't right. Felt like I left part of myself here." Zara's throat tightened with emotion. "We missed you too." Brody took a step closer. "I know it's fast, know we've known each other less than a week, but I've lived enough to recognize when something's real, when it matters." He opened his hand to reveal a simple ring, a band of silver with a small, perfect pearl set in its center. "This was my mother's, only thing of value I own, besides my horse and saddle." Zara stared at the ring, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Brody must hear it. I'm not asking for an answer today, Brody said quickly. That wouldn't be right, but I wanted you to know my intentions. I want to court you proper, Zara Cooper, want to be there for you and Sarah. And someday, if you'll have me, I want to be your husband. Tears filled Zara's eyes, blurring her vision. Brody. I know a woman like you could have any man, he continued, his own voice rough with emotion. And you barely know me, but something happened in that lined shack, something I can't explain but can't deny either. I felt it too, Zara whispered, one tear spilling over and trailing down her cheek. Brody reached out and gently wiped it away with his thumb. So I'm asking permission to call on you, to spend time with you and Sarah, to show you the man I am so you can decide if I'm the man you want. Zara looked down at her daughter, then back up at Brody, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt in her heart. I already know what kind of man you are, Brody Yates. You're the kind who stops for a stranger in need, who delivers a baby without flinching, who carves toys for children not his own. She shifted Sarah to one arm and extended her other hand. And yes, you have my permission to call on me, to court me, to be part of our lives. Brody's face broke into a smile that transformed him, erasing years of hard living from his features. He took her offered hand and, in a gesture that surprised her with its tenderness, raised it to his lips. Thank you, he said simply, tucking the ring back into his pocket. It'll be right here, waiting for the day you're ready. From inside the house came the sound of a throat being cleared loudly, followed by Elias's voice. Is it safe to bring out that coffee now? Zara laughed, the joy in her heart spilling over. Yes, Uncle Elias, it's safe. As her uncle emerged with a tray of coffee cups, Zara looked at Brody, standing tall and proud beside her, and at Sarah, peaceful in her arms. 3 days ago, she had thought she could wait 3 days for a chance at forever. Now, forever was just beginning. Summer turned to autumn on the Cooper homestead, and with the changing season came changes to Zara's life that she could never have imagined when she first set out from St. Louis. Sarah thrived, growing from a fragile, premature infant into a robust baby with curious eyes and a ready smile. The tiny wooden horse Brody had carved sat on a shelf in her nursery, waiting for the day she would be old enough to play with it. True to his word, Brody courted Zara with respectful dedication. He brought wildflowers when they bloomed on the prairie, read to Sarah from books he purchased in town, and spent every Sunday afternoon with them after church services. He worked tirelessly on Elias's South Pasture project, proving himself as capable and trustworthy as the older man had believed. By the time the first snow dusted the distant mountains, Zara knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home not just in the physical place of the Cooper homestead, but in the heart of the quiet cowboy who had delivered her daughter, and in the process, delivered her from a future of uncertainty and loneliness. On a crisp November evening, with Sarah safely asleep in her cradle and the rest of the household retired for the night, Zara and Brody sat on the porch swing, a woolen blanket draped across their laps against the chill. First winter storm's coming, Brody observed, looking at the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. Can smell it in the air. Zara agreed, nestled comfortably against his side, his arm around her shoulders, a warm weight she had come to cherish. Uncle Elias says it will be a hard one. We're ready, Brody assured her. Barns are full of hay, storerooms stocked with preserves. Your uncle plans well. Another family trait, Zara said with a smile, planning for the future. Brody's arm tightened slightly around her. Speaking of the future. He shifted, turning to face her more directly. It's been nearly 4 months since I asked to court you. Zara's heart quickened. Has it been so long already? Long enough for me to be sure of what I already knew, Brody said, his voice dropping to a lower register that sent a pleasant shiver through her. But is it long enough for you? Zara looked into his eyes, remembering the first time she'd seen them storm blue and concerned as she knelt in pain on the prairie. Now they held a different emotion, one that matched the feeling in her own heart. Yes, she said simply, it's long enough. Brody's breath caught and he reached into his pocket, withdrawing the pearl ring he had shown her months before. Zara Cooper, will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to Sarah and perhaps, God willing, more children to come? Will you build a life with me here under these Montana skies? Tears of joy welled in Zara's eyes. Yes, Brody Yates. Yes to all of it. He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, a kiss of promise, of passion held in check, of a future bright with possibility. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, glittering in the light spilling from the house windows. "When?" Brody asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Christmas," Zara decided. "A small ceremony here at the homestead. Just family and close friends." "Perfect," Brody agreed. "Best Christmas gift a man could ask for." They sat together as the snow fell around them, cocooned in the warmth of their shared blanket and shared dreams. Zara thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss of her husband, the difficult decision to travel west alone and pregnant, the terrifying early labor on the open prairie. What had seemed like the darkest moment of her life had led her to the brightest. She thought of that night in the lined shack, of Brody's strong hand holding hers through each contraction, of the look of wonder on his face when Sarah took her first breath. She thought she'd deliver alone. The cowboy stood holding her hand until morning. The words came to her like a line from a story, but it was her story, their story, one they would tell Sarah when she was old enough to understand. "What are you thinking about?" Brody asked, his voice a comforting rumble against her side. "How sometimes the thing you fear most leads you to the thing you need most," Zara replied, looking up at him with love in her eyes. "And how grateful I am that you found me that day." Brody's smile was tender as he brushed a snowflake from her cheek. "No, Zara, you found me." The Cooper homestead was transformed for Christmas, and the wedding that would take place on Christmas Eve. Martha and the other women had decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and candles glowed in every window. The aroma of roasting turkey and baking pies filled the air, mingling with the scent of fresh pine. In the bedroom that had been hers since arriving at the homestead, Zara stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing herself in the elegant cream-colored gown that Martha and the neighboring women had helped her sew. Her copper hair was arranged in soft curls, adorned with small white flowers, and a simple veil cascaded down her back. Sarah, now nearly 6 months old and thriving, lay in her cradle, dressed in a white gown with a tiny ribbon in her dark hair. She had her mother's eyes, now definitely hazel, but everyone agreed she had inherited Brody's quiet, watchful nature. A knock at the door preceded Martha's entrance. The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears as she took in the sight of Zara in her wedding finery. "Oh, my dear," she said, pressing a hand to her heart. "You look absolutely beautiful. That man won't know what hit him." Zara smiled, her own eyes moist with emotion. "Thank you, Martha, for everything you've done to make today perfect." "Nonsense," Martha said, though she looked pleased. "Now, your uncle is waiting to walk you down the aisle, such as it is, and that handsome groom of yours is pacing so much I fear he'll wear a hole in the parlor floor." Zara laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting any longer." She lifted Sarah from the cradle, cradling her close. Together they followed Martha to the hallway where Elias waited, resplendent in his Sunday best, his silver hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed for the occasion. "My dear girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You look just like your mother on her wedding day." Zara blinked back tears. "Thank you for giving me a home, Uncle Elias, for everything." "It is I who should thank you," he replied, offering his arm. "You've brought light and life back to this old house. Now, shall we go make that cowboy of yours the happiest man in Montana territory?" The parlor had been arranged for the ceremony, with the furniture pushed back to create a small aisle leading to where the minister from Copper Creek stood before the fireplace. Neighbors and friends from surrounding homesteads filled the room, all standing as Zara appeared in the doorway. But Zara had eyes only for Brody, who stood tall and straight in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. The look of awe and love that transformed his features as he saw her made her heart swell with emotion. With Sarah in one arm and her other hand on her uncle's elbow, Zara walked toward her future. When they reached Brody, Elias placed her hand in his, the symbolic gesture of giving her away complete with his approving nod. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises of love and fidelity, of partnership and support, of creating a family together. When Brody spoke of being a father to Sarah and any other children with which God may bless us, Zara felt a secret joy, knowing that another child was already growing within her, though she had not yet shared the news with anyone. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Brody kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Sarah, caught between them, made a sound of delight that caused the assembled guests to laugh. "Mrs. Yates," Brody whispered against her lips, the new name a caress. "Mr. Yates," she returned, her smile radiant. The celebration that followed was joyous, a feast prepared by Martha and the neighboring women, music provided by a fiddler from a nearby homestead, dancing that continued well into the night. Brody proved to be surprisingly light on his feet for a cowboy, spinning Zara around the cleared space in the parlor with confident grace. As midnight approached, Elias called for everyone's attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Brody and Zara Yates," he said, his voice carrying over the gathered guests. "May your life together be as bright as the star that guided the wise men on that first Christmas night." Cheers and applause followed, and then it was time for the newlyweds to depart. Not for a honeymoon trip, such luxuries were impractical in their frontier life, but to the cabin on the edge of the property that would be their home. Brody had spent the autumn months expanding and improving it, adding a nursery for Sarah and another bedroom for the children they hoped would follow. Bundled against the cold, with Sarah wrapped warmly between them, Brody and Zara said their goodbyes and stepped out into the crisp December night. A sleigh waited, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, the horse stamping impatiently in the snow. Brody helped Zara and Sarah into the sleigh, tucking warm buffalo robes around them before taking up the reins. As they pulled away from the main house, the sounds of celebration fading behind them, Zara leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. The sleigh runners cut through the fresh snow, the only sound in the stillness of the winter night. Above them, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet, and a full moon cast a silver glow over the landscape. "I have something to tell you," Zara said after a moment, her voice soft with wonder. "A Christmas gift of sorts." Brody glanced down at her, curiosity in his eyes. "What's that?" Zara took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "By next summer, Sarah will have a brother or sister." Brody's intake of breath was sharp, his hand spreading protectively over her still flat abdomen. "Truly?" Zara nodded, her smile visible in the moonlight. "Truly." With a whoop of joy that startled the horse, Brody pulled Zara closer, being careful not to disturb the now sleeping Sarah. "Best Christmas gift a man could ask for," he said, echoing his words from the night of their engagement. "Even better than a wife," Zara teased. "Nothing's better than that," Brody assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But this comes mighty close." They continued toward their cabin, where a fire had been laid in readiness for their arrival, where their life together would truly begin. Zara thought once more of that night in the lined shack, of how fate or providence had brought Brody to her when she needed him most. From the darkest moment of her life had come its greatest joy. As if reading her thoughts, Brody spoke, his voice low and filled with emotion. "That day I found you on the prairie. I was supposed to be elsewhere, had no business being in that particular spot at that particular time, but something, call it instinct or divine guidance, led me there." "I'm glad it did," Zara said softly. "I can't imagine my life without you in it now." "Nor I without you," Brody replied. "You and Sarah, and this little one on the way." His hand remained on her stomach, a protective gesture that made her heart swell with love. "My family." The cabin came into view, lamplight glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney, a beacon of warmth and welcome in the winter night. Their home. The place where they would raise their children, where they would build their life together, where they would face whatever joys and challenges the future held, side by side. As Brody helped her from the sleigh, Sarah still sleeping peacefully in her arms, Zara looked up at the man who had become her husband, her partner, her love. In his eyes, she saw reflected all the happiness she felt in her own heart. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," Brody said, his voice husky with emotion as he lifted her over the threshold. "Home," Zara repeated, the word filled with all the meaning and promise of their shared future. "Yes, this is exactly where we belong." Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the expanded Yates homestead, now a thriving ranch in its own right, carved from the section of land Zara Cooper had granted Brody as part of their partnership. The original cabin had grown with the family, additional rooms added as children arrived. First Thomas, born 7 months after that Christmas wedding, named for Zara's first husband in a gesture of respect and remembrance. Then twins Elias and Sarah, named for her uncle and herself, now 2 years old and into everything. Zara stood on the porch, watching as Brody taught 5-year-old Sarah to ride her own pony, a gentle creature selected specifically for her. The little girl sat straight and confident in the small saddle, her dark hair so like her father's braided down her back, her hazel eyes so like her mother's bright with excitement. "Look, Mama," she called, waving one hand while carefully holding the reins with the other as Brody had taught her. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see you, darling," Zara called back, smiling at the pride in her daughter's voice. "You're doing wonderfully." Brody walked alongside the pony, one hand loosely holding a lead rope, ready to take control if needed but giving Sarah the feeling of independence she craved. He looked up at Zara, his smile as warm and loving as it had been on their wedding day. In the corral near the barn, 4-year-old Thomas played under the watchful eye of Martha, who had chosen to move to the Yates homestead when Zara Cooper remarried 3 years earlier. The twins napped inside the house, giving Zara a rare moment of relative quiet. Her hand drifted to her stomach, where the first flutter of movement from their 5th child had just made itself known. She hadn't told Brody yet, wanting to be sure before sharing the news. At 28, she found this pregnancy easier than her previous ones, her body now accustomed to the process of creating life. As if sensing her thoughts, Brody said something to Sarah, then jogged toward the porch, leaving the little girl circling slowly in the fenced area under Martha's expanded supervision. "Everything all right?" he asked as he reached Zara, concern in his eyes. "You've been standing there looking thoughtful," Zara smiled, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach, a gesture that had become familiar over the years. "Everything is perfect." Brody's eyes widened, then crinkled at the corners as a broad smile spread across his face. "Again, really?" Zara nodded, laughing at his expression of delighted surprise. "Really, in winter, I think, January or February." Brody pulled her into his arms, mindful of the curious eyes of their daughter in the distance. 5 children, he marveled. Who would have thought? "Not the lonely widow who set out from St. Louis 6 years ago," Zara said, leaning into his embrace. "Nor, I imagine, the solitary cowboy who found her on the prairie. Best day of my life," Brody said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "finding you." Zara looked out at their expanded homestead, the thriving garden, the well-tended fields, the healthy cattle grazing in the distance, and most importantly, their children, living proof of the love they shared. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked, "in the line shack?" "Often," Brody admitted. "How scared we both were, how brave you were. How you never left, even when you could have ridden for help," Zara said softly. "You stayed, held my hand until morning. Couldn't have done otherwise," Brody said simply. "Somehow I knew even then." "Knew what?" "That you were my future." He placed his hand on her stomach again, feeling the new life growing within. That we were meant to build this together. From the corral, Sarah called for her father to watch a new skill she'd mastered. Thomas, waking from his outdoor nap, ran toward the porch calling for his mother. Inside, one of the twins began to cry, waking the other. Brody chuckled, pressing one more quick kiss to Zara's lips before stepping back. "Duty calls, Mrs. Yates." "Indeed it does, Mr. Yates," she replied with a smile. As Brody jogged back to Sarah and Zara turned to scoop up Thomas before heading inside to the twins, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. The path that had led her here had not been easy or straightforward. It had been marked by loss and fear, by moments of despair and uncertainty. But it had also been marked by courage and hope, by unexpected kindness and love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. And now, surrounded by the family she and Brody had created together, Zara knew that every step of that journey had been worth it. She had thought she would deliver alone, but the cowboy had stood holding her hand until morning. And in that simple act of human kindness, a love story had begun, one that continued to unfold with each passing day, each new child, each shared challenge and triumph. A love story that, like the Montana sky above them, seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon, vast and beautiful and full of promise.